Have you ever been stuck in one of those political arguments that just goes nowhere? You know, the kind that's totally draining, makes no logical sense, and just leaves you exhausted? Well, one blogger got so fed up with it that they came up with this really unique and, let's be honest, deeply sarcastic philosophy for how to escape. So let's dive into their guide for what they call political mirroring. The entire idea is built on this one single rule, this one core principle. The author's whole starting point is this: if a conversation can't lead to some real, tangible benefit for everyone involved, then it's just not worth having. This one idea is the bedrock for everything else we're about to talk about. All right, so here's our game plan. First, we'll look at the problem that mirroring is supposed to solve. Then, we'll get into the antidote itself. After that, we'll break down its core formula, learn how to spot the kind of arguments where you'd use it, and finally, we'll get into the big question: is this whole thing selfish or not? So first up, let's just diagnose the problem. I think we all know this feeling, right? That sense of complete frustration with so many political debates today. It's the entire reason this weird philosophy even exists. Yeah, according to the source material, the root of the problem is that these arguments, they aren't really about facts or logic anymore. They're about feelings. They're about which team you're on and about just digging your heels in. And the end result isn't progress. It's just people getting worn out and more divided than ever. Okay, so if that's the problem, what's the solution? Well, this is where we get to the main event, political mirroring. And it's a method that isn't designed to help you win an argument, but to help you escape it with your sanity still in one piece. Now, this definition, it's really specific, and you gotta admit, it's pretty arrogant sounding. But look at the key phrases here. For expediency, that means it's a shortcut, a practical tactic. And then there's intellectual superiority. So right off the bat, this whole thing is framed as a tool for people who think they're, just a little bit above the fray. And this is absolutely crucial. A mirror agent, as the author calls them, is not trying to convince anybody of anything. The goal here is purely tactical. It's all about saving your own time, your own mental energy, by creating just enough harmony to end the conversation so you can get back to doing something that's actually productive. So how do you actually do this? Well, the author actually breaks it down into a simple little formula they call the mirror equation. It's got three main parts. First is belief acceptance. That's just you willingly agreeing with what the other person is saying. The second is context, which is super important. This only lasts for that one specific conversation you're trying to escape. And what's the result? Harmony. The other person feels heard, the argument dies, and you get to walk away. But wait, how do you know which arguments to mirror? You can't just agree with everything, right? Well, the author makes this really important distinction between two kinds of truth. He says rational debates are about little truths, facts, figures, stuff you can actually discuss. But irrational arguments, those are about big truth with a capital T. These are huge, faith-based worldviews. And mirroring, that's a tool made specifically for dealing with those big truth arguments. And that brings us to maybe the most practical part of this whole idea, basically, a field guide for how to spot the kinds of arguments that are, in the author's words, mirrorable. The author lays out this really common pattern. It starts with what he calls a micro-fault, some small, bad thing that happened to someone personally. But in an argument, emotions take over, and it blows up into a macro-fault. Now it's a universal problem with society. And then finally, some vague, abstract group, a party to a blame, gets all the blame. That huge leap from a personal story to a sweeping condemnation, that's your red flag. And the author has this umbrella term for all these tactics that swap out a real argument for an emotional symbol. He calls them totems. And the whole point of a totem is that you can't really argue with it because it was never based on logic in the first place. So then he breaks these totems down into a few specific types he calls logic busters. And they're called that because they're designed to be completely impossible to refute with logic. Let's decode a few of them. Okay, so here's a quick translation guide. Fossil ideologies are just old, prepackaged ideas that people repeat without really thinking about them. Chameleons, that's when someone uses a celebrity as if they're some kind of expert. Infantilism is when you use a kid's emotional reaction as proof of something. And animalism is when an argument is so simple that, even my dog gets it. All of these are seen as shortcuts to just bypass a real debate. All right, so now you know how to spot these arguments and you've got the equation. But the really big question is still hanging out there. Is doing this okay? Is it ethical? Or is it just a cynical excuse to duck out of hard conversations? So here's where it gets really interesting. The author's defense is kind of surprising. They don't see this as cynical at all. They actually frame it as a form of altruism. The argument goes like this. You are sacrificing your own desire to win, your desire to crush a flawed argument, all for the sake of giving someone else the emotional peace they're looking for. And this really gets to the core of it, doesn't it? On one hand, you have the author's view that mirroring is this noble sacrifice you make for social peace. But on the other hand, couldn't you see it as just pure hedonism? Just a clever way to selfishly avoid any personal discomfort and take the easy way out of a tough conversation? Ultimately, that's the big question this whole philosophy leaves us hanging with. Is political mirroring a smart, rational tool for protecting your own sanity in a world full of illogical arguments? Or is it just a deeply cynical way to check out from our shared responsibility to actually talk to each other? Well, that's something for you to decide.